everyone. So welcome to another texturing tutorial. In this tutorial, we're gonna go through baked mesh map and why you have to do it, how to set up adjustment layer. These adjustment layer would be very useful for when you want to quickly change the color of like the whole material as a whole. And then also blur slope filter, but the advanced setting, because this one would be very important for us when we're starting to get into Stylize texturing and more of the oil painting style, and also how to create smart material so that it could speed up your workflow. So rather than having to recreate new material every time you're texturing, you could create something very nice and fully procedural, and then quickly create a smart material out of it and reapply that material on a tons of other objects without having to restart from ground zero. So here I have the workstation that I have imported over from Maya. A few settings that you need to make sure, because we're working with UDIM here, is that when you import a new object, it's very important to make sure you check use UV tile workflow and also convert UV tiles into individual texture set legacy, so that you can get the different UDIM setup rather than having to create separate material for different geometry on the whole thing. And also to be able to fully using procedural tools such as let me create something real fast. So to be able to use procedural stuff, so like the generator, these generator are using a thing called mesh map, and these are curvature map, ambient occlusion map, world space normal map, that if you don't bake your mesh map beforehand, you will not have anything. So this is what your file will look like when you first created it. You have to hit bake mesh map, click this use low poly mesh at high poly mesh button, and then start baking. But I already did that, so I have all of these maps. So what these map does is that they take a closer inspection onto your geometry, see where the curvature points are, see where does the geometry meeting each other, the ambient occlusion, and just like take a closer inspect to your object to see how does your object constructed, to further like create these other tools that you could use, like make your workflows more procedural and faster. Okay, so that was what bake mesh map do. Now we could get into adjustment layer. So I know that a lot of you like to use smart material on the internet, and that's a very quick way to do it, but sometimes the smart material just might not always work with your object. And for like this material, for instance, like if I want to change the whole thing into blue, I either have to go into all of these and change it to blue, everything kind of like a little bit blue color. Let me change this one. Oh, this one I can't even change it because they use another smart material. Yeah, so like for instance, if you want to change color, sometimes you can't even do it. So the quickest way to do it is to create an adjustment layer on top. What you could do is you could create a paint layer with the paintbrush. Make sure that it's outside of everything. Let's name it adjustment layer. And you could add a bunch of filter on this that will start activating on everything that is like below it. You have to set this layer into pass-through. And now if I add a filter into this, for instance, I'm gonna add a HSL perceptive, and then I can go in and change the hue. It's changed the hue of the whole thing as a whole. So this could speed up your workflow a lot. And for instance, I see that it's very bumpy and stuff, and I really don't want the bump to be this much, like you can see on the surface right now. I could go in and add a level on this adjustment layer and make sure that this level only affects the height. And now when I move this point, oh, I need to go into the height and make sure this is also pass through. So like this is how you like personally control the different setting of each layer, because each layer has all kind of setting for all of these properties. So you need to make sure that if you change it to pass through and you want it to work, for instance the height layer, you have to go into here, change it to height, change it to pass through, and now it's gonna start working. You see how the surface start to change. I can zoom in a little bit more. So adjustment layer could be a very quick way for you to adjust the smart material without having to go into the actual material setup and mess around with it. So yeah, that was adjustment layer. And for the workflow that we go through, we're gonna utilize blur slope filter a lot, because blur slope is what mostly make them everything looks very stylized. So I'm also gonna use adjustment layer, but this time instead of using all these settings, I'm gonna add a filter and add a blur slope right here. So if you add this, like see everything start to like break up a little bit and it looks super stylized. So this is good enough-ish, but there are other way that you could improve it to make it even better. So this is the intensity. This is like the most basic setting of it. You could change like how strong this thing work, and especially if your object has a lot of detail and you want to make sure that you can do minor adjustment without like this one. For instance, you move a little bit on the intensity and it's changed so much. If you want to control it better, you could change this divider into 10. So now it's on like amount of 10. So like every time it's moved a little bit less, so you have further control. And if you change it to 1,000, it's even, yeah, it's barely show anything. And so I'm usually use 10. And this blending mode, each of these do something a little bit different, so it might be worth it to try around. I think blur is just like blur it in general, but min allow you to keep a lot of the original texture and it does not mess around too much. Like mins keep the majority of the silhouette of the original color, and I think max blurs it out like the bigger detail, I think. But I think mins or blur would be just nice enough, but just something to keep in mind that you could change these around. I don't use the quality bar before. And one thing that would be very fun and would be a game changer when it's come to blur slope is using the source parameter and using your own noise. So here in the source parameter, one thing about blur slope is it works better when the maps is being very blurry, and this one is currently has its default noise, but the more you blur it, like see it's start to deform the the surface, like deform the way that the maps work a lot. If you get into system designer, usually they explain a little bit better in there on how blur slope work, but I guess this is the best I could do here. And source tiling is decide how much does the noise being tiling up. So the more you add, like the more you see the noise, it start to get like smaller shape. Like this one is kind of big shape. Like see, like if you look carefully, the blurriness point is a very big blurry point, and the more you add in, the more these blurry points getting smaller and smaller and smaller ish. Yeah, I hope you could see that. And contrast, yeah, just something to keep in mind to play around with. I usually play around with the source tiling and the blur button and the blur parameter. And the position, I'm not really sure what it does, but it take away some of the blurriness, and like some of it's like very clear, and it's go the same for both direction of the parameter, both end of the parameter. So it's take away some of the blurriness. Might be something worth it to keep in mind about, or you can just hit restore to default. And what I usually use, especially for our workflows, is we're gonna use custom noise. So if you go into this tab, the texture tab, and search for brush, I usually use the grunge wipe brush, drag it over and drop into custom noise. And to activate, let me go into the 3D view. To activate the custom noise, I would go into source type under source parameter, change it to custom noise, and see you start to see a little bit of the brush swipe. That's what the custom noise does, and it could be very cool so that you could use a smart material and use this custom noise on top to create like the painterly kind of look. It's look like it's being swiped around. And to make this to another level, we're gonna use source tiling. I'm gonna make this thing a little bit bigger so you see like these noise are kind of going in a direction, and I will blur it up a little bit. 0.4 maybe. This one 0.2 maybe. Might require some effort to mess around to see which one looks good. Min, max, or just blur. And I like to use a lot of this. Source tiling. See, like, but it starts to break up the geometry a lot, and see how it's so interesting to look at, I think. Okay, what about I just stop here for now. And one thing that will help push the blur, the painterly style even better is you have to go still into the material and make sure that these rusted details very large, looks very large. So like you see how there's a lot of smaller detail and stuff here. We need to make sure that the edges of these details are more defined. And what I means is, let me get that. Okay, this rust layer, you have to make sure that the contrast of these parameter is being pushed a little bit higher so that you see less of these little details and more of the larger details. You might have to play around with parameter a little bit, because you see how when I apply this, it looks nice, and like the color looks less grayish. It's look more defined, where the contrast of what underneath is a lot. And like make sure that the detail is big so that it looks very painterly. Yeah, that's all I have. I guess that's what I have to say the most. So it still requires you to go in and play with the smart material, but keep in mind that the bigger the color contrast area is, the better it looks like on those filter. Like look right here, it just look pretty random. But if you want like it's more stylized and more defined, you have to make sure that the layers underneath are having large contrast like this. And something a little bit side note, but something might be fun to use for stylized stuff is you could add a black mask and then add the generator and add a curvature generator. So the curvature generator will make sure the edges are like having some highlight. If I go to the base material, you see how the edges have some highlight. What if I change it to a light yellow? Add a little bit of stuff in, like give it a little bit of a stylized highlight edges. Might be something fun to play around with. Our model is kind of low poly, so maybe sometime you have to go in and actually paint these edges. But like for a quicker workflow, it would be very nice to utilize the generator, and that's why we have to make a mesh map. So yeah, that was a sum up on blur slope for stylized material. Just play around with the parameters and maybe try different type of maps to see which one create the best effects in your opinion. And then next, we would go into smart material. So after you create something that you're happy with, especially with the adjustment layer, because you can just literally create one adjustment layer and apply that on all materials. So so to make your workflow quicker, you could group everything together. After you like it, just select, sorry, let me undo real quick. Select everything, shift select everything, Control G, and name this a name. I just call it Smart Mat Test. So you see how when you import a smart material in, they come on like a folder type. You can create the same with your own smart material. If you're happy with a material that you have created, you could create a group out of it, right click on it, and create smart material. And this smart material is gonna show up in your folder. Here is the one that I just created. And now if you go to another object, or I guess just another layer for instance, I still have this thing that I have in like texture. You could drag and drop, and it's automatically create on like apply the material on everything. You just have to go in and fix the parameter to make sure that it works better. So I could reduce some of the edges here. If I move this layer under the adjustment layer, it starts to break it up too, because the adjustment layer affects everything under it. I could go into rust, maybe reduce the rustiness a little bit to make sure it's matched. And I see that the blur slope on this one is so big compared to this one. I could quickly go into here and change the size of the blur slope. Yeah, just play around with them. Yeah, somewhat better. So yeah, and with this smart material, it's also carried to over, like it's gonna come with your, especially if you use your school account to assign it into Substance Painter, this smart material will go with you everywhere. Because I literally have these wood material that I create from last year and it's still in my account. So for instance, right now if I open another file, let's see, uh, let me put it on Daydream, maybe. Okay, so I have Daydream here. This, oh yeah, he already had baked mesh map. I could drag this material, drop it here, and boom, he's fully textured. It's such a quick workflow. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. Thank you for watching. Good luck.